Hi everyone! So this is me once again showing my face at the end of the year to share some of my favorite reads from 2023. And one of my resolutions from 2024 is to continue making videos for this channel. So if you have subscribed here and haven't gotten any contents whatsoever, I'm sorry for that, but hopefully you'll be getting more contents in the upcoming years. So without further ado, I am going to take you into this journey with me where I talk about some of my most favorite reads of 2023. And I'm not gonna lie, 2023 has been one of the best book reading years for me. I have read like 56 books, and it was really hard to narrow it down to top books of 2023. There are so many books I want to talk about, but I narrowed it down to specific genres and specific books for you guys to read. These are the books that I think that nobody should miss reading. I have categorized the books in separate genres. So for those of you who don't know me or haven't seen videos before in this channel, is I mostly read fantasy as a genre, and if not fantasy, I most of the time read literary fiction or romance. So I'm not going to be talking about the romance selection because I talked about them a lot in my Bookstagram account. So I'm going to be talking about some of my fantasy favorites and some of my favorite literary fiction or contemporary reads, which I think everybody should read. Let's start off with our contemporary and literary fiction genre. So the first book I have to talk about in this genre that was one of my top reads of 2023 was Almond by, I don't want to pronounce this wrong, Yong Fyong Song. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but she's a Korean author, and this is a Korean book that was translated into English, and it's a contemporary read, more of a contemporary literary fiction read. It's about a young boy who suffers from a very rare disorder where he can feel the emotions of fear or anger. And I know specifically in my generation, a lot of people want to be able to feel nothing at all. But when I read this book, one of the reasons why I like this book so much is because it takes such a how do I say it, a very common concept, because this is something that we all often think about, that I don't want to feel so angry, I don't want to feel so sad. But she took this concept, this author, she took this concept and made such a beautiful story out of it. And when you read this book, you realize that how significant all these negative emotions as well as positive emotions are, how significant these are in our life. It's a very short book, so if you're someone who's not into reading that much but just want to dabble into reading a little bit, I think this is a great book to pick up. It's under 200 pages, and it's the amount of emotions the author can pack in this 200 pages is astounding. And I think everybody should, even if you're not a reader, this is a great book to start. So the second book I want to talk about is Loveless by Alice Oseman. Alice Oseman is popular for writing young adult contemporary novels, but more about the sexualities and the coming of age aspects of this YA genre. So Loveless is about a girl who is coming into terms with her sexuality, and we not only follow this main girl, but also we follow her whole friend group, how they are going through all these changes in a new environment, in a new situation, in a new world, and how this transition between young adult and adulthood, and how you have to figure all of these things out while transitioning into it. That is something that this author really beautifully portrays in her book. And even though this book is marketed as young adult, I think that this is also another book that anybody, specifically any adults who want to get into reading, can read, because it's very easy to get into. The characters are super lovable, and there's a fun family trope in it, so of course a win-win. All right, so the next book I have to talk about is called Cleopatra and Frankenstein, a book about very messy people, very messy relationships, and very messy human emotions. It's a book about two characters called Cleo and Frank, and it starts off as a love story, but it ends up as more of a self-exploration, more exploration on really human relationships and human emotions. and it's very messy. Fair warning, there are a lot of trigger warnings for this book, and I went to this thinking that as it is marketed, it's going to be a romance book or it's going to be a love story, but it's not. It's the furthest thing from a romance book or a love story. It's very disturbing. It got very triggering at times, but I personally loved this book because there were scenes, there were characters who were very much messed up emotionally, but I related a lot to these characters, and I have seen people read these books and saw them relate to these characters as well. I mean, they're the worst parts of human emotions portrayed by these characters, but you cannot help but feel like, okay, so I also have felt these things. I also have gone through some of these things, no matter how ugly or how messy they are. So yeah, that's Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Millers, I think the author's name. Give it a read. The next one is another one of those books that I want to erase my memory of reading it and read it again because it was so good. It was so good. It's called The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. It's again a sort of historical fiction slash literary fiction. It follows the life of a female pilot in a very remote area of America in the 1960s, 50s, and it's incredible. It's like these characters. It's a very character focused story, so keep that in mind. It's not a very plot heavy story or action based story. It follows this girl who has a very traumatic childhood, who has a very messy childhood, and of course during a time when it was very uncommon for a female to fly planes all around the world, this girl has this very deep sense of wanderlust, very deep sense of ambitions, and it also centers around a lot of side characters surrounding this girl's life, which I think I enjoyed, made the book even more interesting for me. And I don't know, I can't even describe this book without getting emotional. It was so fantastic. The characters were incredibly well done. The book's really big, all right? So don't be intimidated by the size of it, but it's necessary for the book to be big, for the characters to be fleshed out, because the characters are so well written and it almost feels like an epic. I mean, I looked up on Google, like, is this real? Was really there a female pilot like this? Because I was so hooked by the characters that I wanted them to be real. I wanted it to be a real story, but it's not. It's a fictional story, but it's incredibly powerful. It's beautiful, it's emotional, it's a heck of a ride. So yeah, Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. And the final book in this category, contemporary slash literary fiction, is called Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. So if you have been following me on Bookstagram, you probably know R.F. Kuang is one of my favorite authors of all time. And I know this book, specifically Yellowface, is a hit or miss for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who didn't like this book, but I finished this book in 3 hours of time. Like, I just sat down, and when I got up, it was like 3 hours have passed and I finished a whole like 300-page book, which is very rare for me. I read books really slowly, like compared to that. So it's very hooking, very intriguing. So what's it about? It's about the publishing industry. It's about this author who steals the work, who steals a manuscript from another author of color who has passed away, and this author who stole the manuscript is white. So she's a white main character, and the book is told from her point of view. So we get all these glimpses of very casual racism, very casual Eurocentric point of views, and it's just, R.F. Kuang does things in a very subtle and but very harsh ways. Like, she does all these takes on racism, sexism, colonialism, and white supremacy, and all these big, heavy topics. She does it in a so subtle but in a very brutal way. You're like, it just, R.F. Kuang can do no wrong. Just, if you haven't read any books by R.F. Kuang, I would suggest that if you start reading by this one, because this is a very easier book to get into, because her other writings are in fantasy, and I know fantasy isn't really accessible for a lot of you. So Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Alright, so that's it for the contemporary and literary fiction part. Now I have one specific recommendation for the classics part. I'm a literature student, as I already said, so I read a lot of classics. But I read one classic this year that I want to give a huge shout out to, and I know a lot of you have probably already read it, but if you haven't, please, 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 please read this book. So the book is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery, and if you haven't heard about it, it's about a girl called Anne, who's an orphan who gets adopted into this family of a brother and sister, and it's it's hard to explain this book because there's not any specific plots to it. It's just all cozy vibes and beautiful atmosphere and beautiful lines and so much lovable characters. Like every single character of this book you're gonna fall in love with. There's not one bad character. All of them are not super interesting, but very much lovable, very much rootable. You would want to, like, at the end of the book or after finishing the book, you'd want to hug every one of these characters. So it's a very popular book. I know it has been recommended a lot of times before, but yeah, Anne of Green Gables. And also, please watch the Netflix adaptation of it. I know anybody who's a bookworm knows that the adaptation never comes close to the main book, but in this case, I actually love the adaptation even more. I saw the adaptation before, then I read the book, and I love them both separately so much. But if you are someone who doesn't want to read the book, still, please watch this adaptation of by Netflix, and with an E. The next genre is a little bit of surprise for me. It's horror. Yes, I have read like a lot of horror books this year, and some of them were really good, but if you know me, I'm a very big scaredy cat. I scare very easily. So I have never read horrors that much before, unless you count the children's horror stories. So yeah, these books are I'm including these books here because I think they're not only a big shout out to the horror genre, but also they're a very good shout out to, I don't know, they're like very close to the genre of social commentary through horror. So yeah, let's dive into the book. So the first one is Middle Game by Shannon McQuare. So this is a book, this is not about any social commentary. This one is about two brothers and sisters, they're twins. Your general horror story, they're made in a lab, they're made for a scientific experiment, and they're separated when they're born, but they have this telepathic connection with each other. It's marketed as a horror book, but it's more of a fantasy thriller sort of genre. And I love this book so much because the relationship between the brother and sister was something incredible. It was really well done. And I also think there are very gory scenes in these books, but I think that somebody just getting into the horror genre, this is a great place to start because it not only talks about horror and fantasy elements of this world, it also talks about the relationships and the human emotions involved in these books. And I really love this book. The sibling relationship, the side characters, oh my god, there was a side character in this book. I would give my life for this character. So good. So yeah, Middle Game by Shannon McGuire. And the next one is the one that I was talking about, has a social commentary on it. It's called Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Canas. Big shout out to this author. She's an incredible author. Her another book called Hacienda is another book that I read like in 2022. Love that book so much as well. But Vampires of El Norte is a book I read this year and I loved it so much. It's another horror story, but it also has a very heavy subplot of romance. And you know, the horror story in this book, the ghost in this book is not about ghosts or the supernatural entities. The ghost or the horror in this book is the brutality of colonialism. So yeah, this author, Isabella Canas, is clever that way. And it's incredibly well done. It's so good. When you read the books, you feel like that there are supernatural entities in this book, but you'll feel like the supernatural entities are far more better than these colonial entities. And I think that's a really cool concept. And I also love the love story as well. So if you're someone who loves reading romance books and want to start reading horrors, it's a great genre bending book and I'm sure you're going to love it. And if you love this book, make sure to check out this author's other book, The Hacienda, because I think I love that one even more. Okay, so we have the final category in our video. It's fantasy and sci-fi, my favorite genre of all time. So I would like to start this category with one of my favorite books I read this year, and I got this book as a gift on my birthday from someone whom I least expected to get a gift on my birthday. And you know who you are, and I love you so, so much. Thank you so much for the book. So the book is called Adventures of Amin al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. And oh God, 3 words: Muslim female pirate. It's so, so, so good. It's incredible. If it's so fun and adventurous. I mean, you think it's a very heavy book. It's a very emotional and everything, very much sensitive book, and it is. It deals with a lot of different genres that are very sensitive and very heavy, but it's just such a fun ride. There's found family trope in it. There's a lot of exploration on motherhood in it. The main character, Amin al-Sirafi, as I said, she's a Muslim female pirate, and also she's a mother. We never get to see any middle-aged characters, especially who are mothers, or we don't get to see books from their point of views. They're always in the sidelines, right? But this book about this badass female pirate who's also a mother, who fights her way through all these monsters and goes on all these adventures just to return home to her precious, precious daughter. It's such a beautiful book, such a unique concept. Also, it goes in a very deep dive on Middle Eastern history and psychology, which is very refreshing to see, because not a lot, even most of the fantasy books are mainly Eurocentric. So I really enjoyed this book because of its very unique aspect towards fantasy. And even though the tropes are very common in fantasy genre, like found family, chosen one, pirates, and ocean adventure, but still the concepts were so well done and so uniquely done. I really enjoyed this book. If you're someone who is tired of Eurocentric fantasies and who is tired of very heavy epic fantasies, this is a great palate cleanser, and I'm sure you're going to love it. Adventure of Amin al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. So the next book is called When We Were Birds by Ayana Lloyd Banyo. It's also another very unique, very beautiful book. It's also a very short book, so if you are someone who isn't that much into reading, you can start with this one. It's more of a magical realism than fantasy. It follows these two characters in 2 separate cities of the Caribbean, and we follow them through these family legacies and through their very unique belief systems and their way of being someone who belongs in a broader society, in a broader world. And I love this book so much because it very much delves into the concept of the legacy of family trauma. And the author is very good in portraying these emotions that are, again, very uniquely written, very great imagery and metaphors in this book that you don't find often in fantasy books, or at least the ones I've read. And this is just this also, I think some might say it has a subgenre of horror, but I don't know, it's a very sad book, but to me it felt like very wholesome and very cozy and very, I don't know, it felt like a blanket in a cold day. It was just incredible. Read this book. This is a very unique book, trust me. All the books I've read last year, this one is the most unique and most magical reads of them all. The last 3 books are probably the most popular fantasy books of 2023. So I'm going to be brief about it because I'm pretty sure you have seen a lot of reviews by a lot of other book reviewers on these 3 books. So the first one is called A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross. It's a second book of a duology, and Rebecca Ross has become one of my favorite authors of all time. And I read this book, I think the first book, A River Enchanted, in 2023, and I love that book, yes, but it wasn't my favorite read of the year. It was a very magical read, very atmospheric read, but it wasn't my favorite book of the year. But the second installment, was so addicting, so beautifully written, and so magical. So this is basically a book about these 2 rival families in this magical island where there's magic in music, there's magic in trees, and it's just very cozy and very Ghibli-esque. If you're someone who loves Ghibli films or Ghibli aesthetics, this series is a great place to start reading fantasy books, because these books, even every book by this author reminds me of the Ghibli aesthetics. This is also a love story. It has a very heavy subgenre on romance, but the romance is not only focused on one couple, it's focused on two couples. One is the traditional that we get in fantasy genre, a younger and young adult couple, and the another one is a middle-aged couple, and they're very not so much traditional, and that was the secondary romance, but that romance was my favorite romance. I read a lot of romance books this year, but that was probably my most favorite one of them all. And that wasn't even the primary plot or primary romance of the book, but it was so well done and so good. And yeah, if you're someone who loves very atmospheric, very cozy, but very emotional reads, this series is a great place to start. The next one is Hellbent by Lee Bardugo. So this is the second book of the Ninth House series, and this series just gets better and better. I know it's very hard to get into this series because it's written in such a way that not a lot of people can get into it easily, but oh my god, if you just go through the first half of Ninth House series, you just have to push yourself, all right? The first half, I understand it's very slow, it's very difficult to get into, the world building is very complex, but the series just gets better and better. It's a murder mystery plot. It takes place in Yale University. Again, a dark academia read. These secret societies, secret magical societies, these students getting murdered, and then these main few characters, one of them who is Alex Stern, Galaxy Stern, one of my favorite female protagonists of all time. They solve these murders, and they make found family and find love along the way, and it's just such an incredible series. And I love everything Lee Bardugo writes, but I think after Six of Crows, this is one of my favorite books by her. It was so well done. I read this book when I was on a trip, and I never read books when I'm on a trip, but it was so addicting and so good. I couldn't put it down, and I read this book throughout a whole trip. It's so good. Hellbent by Lee Bardugo. And the last one, again, we come back to good old R.F. Kuang. So the last book I want to talk about is Babel. Yes, you can see it here. Here you go. Babel by R.F. Kuang. So this is another book on the effects and the subtle ways of colonialism and white supremacy, but it's more fantasy leaning than contemporary leaning. The book follows our main character Robin, who is a student at Oxford University, and he is part of this group of people who are into translation studies. They go through this translation exercises, linguistic exercises to translate words from their mother tongue to English, or from English to their mother tongue. And even though Robin at first is very intrigued by all this very intriguing, beautiful Oxford University, this very prestigious educational institute, but as time passes, our main character realizes that the people who are recruiting Robin, and people like Robin from all these colonized territories, Robin is from Canton, China. He realizes that a lot of these people who are recruiting him and his classmates are part of this whole big project that are going through all these colonized territories, picking out these people to be their translators or to be the vessel through which they colonize. So Robin and his classmates, they decide that no, enough is enough. We are not going to go through this anymore. And it's all about this sort of resistance, this sort of taking a step back and looking at all these things that we are very interested in, these very prestigious higher education, European educational institutions, but how are they exactly used? How does that affect us or people in a colonized territory or in a formerly colonized territories? And it's just such a good book. Again, R.F. Kuang writes very mind-boggling plot twists, so be careful about that. Also, this book I think also has some trigger warnings, so yeah, go through that before you read this book. Anyway, so Babel by R.F. Kuang. I read this book like I think in the beginning of this year, and this has remained my favorite throughout this whole time. Anyway, so that was my list of books for 2023, and hopefully I'll see you guys with another video pretty soon. Bye.